Hi, Clint Coons here with Anderson Business Advisors, and in this video we're going to discuss when you need to create your first limited liability company. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here's the thing. Investors will call us up here at Anderson all the time and ask, hey, do I need to set up an LLC right now? And the answer is oftentimes, well, it really depends. And I know that sounds like an attorney's answer, but it does, because what we want to analyze is what type of investing are you starting out with and what are you engaging in? Because that's going to drive the determination when is the best time to create that entity to make sure it's going to give you the value you're seeking from setting it up. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to break down a few different strategies and show you when a limited liability company should be set up for your real estate investing. And the best way to do that, of course, is to go to my board. So let me just move this over here. And so we can draw and discuss these strategies. All right, so the first one I want to talk about, when do we look at setting up a limited liability company? Well, if you're an individual who's starting out in real estate and you want to start out with wholesaling, okay, so with wholesaling, you're pretty much aware of the fact that when you're wholesaling property, you're not actually taking title of the property. What you're doing is you're making a lot of offers on real estate. Now, for many individuals who start down this road as a way to build cash flow so they can eventually go out and purchase real estate, you want to set up an entity right out of the gate, okay? You do not want to be making offers in your own name. So I often tell people, hey, let's set up an LLC right away. And what's really important here is when you set up your LLC, you want to make sure that you're electing to treat it as either an S or a C corporation for federal tax purposes. Now, I'm not going to go into the distinction between those two for a wholesaler. That's something we'd want to look at one-on-one when we have a strategy session to make a determination as to what is best given your individual tax situation. But generally speaking, we're going to set up an LLC and it's going to be treated as an S or C Corp for federal tax purposes. Now, the next question that comes up with this when we're saying set up an LLC is, where do you set up this LLC? Now, you've probably heard of Wyoming, Nevada, Delaware, and probably some other states thrown in as well. In fact, if you've watched any of my videos, you know I talk a lot about Wyoming. But again, choosing the right state is important. It must be strategic to make sure that it aligns with the type of investing that you're starting out with. In wholesaling, you're predominantly going to be working most likely in the state in which you reside. So because you're going to be using this entity in the state where you reside, and this entity is going to be paying you a salary, you're better off just setting up the entity in the state that you reside in. So for example, I reside in Washington State. I would set up a Washington Limited Liability Company. So I'd get this set up before I make my first offer. Now, if you're wondering why am I telling you to do this setup before you make your offer, it's because when you make an offer to purchase real estate, you want to do it in the name of the LLC. You want to tie this property up with that seller in the name of the limited liability company, not in your individual name. And why this is important is because if for whatever reason the person that you flip this contract to fails to close on the property, you don't want this seller coming back against you individually and suing you personally. That is really important. Now you're probably wondering, well, how would the seller sue me individually? I'll show you how this happened, and it's happened to some of our clients before that wholesale property. So here's a client. This client went out there, entered into an agreement to buy actually there were several properties, and that's actually a gal, that she tied up under contract with this seller. So she tied up 3 properties under contract with this seller. She then went out and found an investor, again, flipped the contract to the investor to close on the properties. Well, the investor couldn't get their funds together. So what ended up happening is the investor did not close on the 3 properties. And this was after the seller agreed to a few extensions to help the investor out in order to close. Well, because he did not close, the properties themselves were part of a short sale. Okay, so the bank then said, hey, you didn't sell them. We're now coming after you. We're going to get a deficiency judgment against you. And long story short, the bank hit the seller. The seller turned around and sued the investor. Well, actually, the person they entered into the agreement with originally, this person right here, not the person she sold the agreement to, they sued her, okay, because they entered into the contract with her. So they were seeking damages as a result of her failure to close. Now, you've probably heard earnest money is something that's put in a real estate purchase and sale agreement, and that should be the damages, but that's not the case, right? Sellers can sue for specific performance and for actual damages on top of that. So this is a scenario why if you're a wholesaler, you want to be entering into that agreement with your business entity and not in your own name, because when you enter into it in your own name, essentially what you're doing is you're putting yourself at risk. So that's one area. I'm concerned about the seller. So again, if you're wholesaling, get your entity set up right away, make all your offers under the name of that entity. Now, here's another scenario that we just ran into with one of our clients here that was wholesaling property. And again, this client was doing this in their own name and they had not yet started working with us. But when they saw one of my videos, they called us up and they said, hey, I realize I need to get protection. Because in this scenario, what happened is, again, you go back to the example. Here's the client, reaches out to a seller on a piece of property, ties this property up under agreement in their own name. They turn around, flip it to an investor. Now, unlike the first example I shared with you, in this example, this investor actually bought the property. The investor closed on the property. But here's what happened. The investor closed on the property, and then once they took title to the property, they found out there was a serious toxic mold problem in this property that had resulted from leaky pipes in the flooring, all right, that ran through the flooring of the house. And so they had to expend considerable amounts of money to remedy this. They turned around and they sued the wholesaler individually. Now, you could argue, well, the wholesaler didn't know and they should have sold it as is, and all the things that you should be doing if you're a wholesaler to protect yourself. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. If they want to sue you, they're going to sue you. So this is another example of why, as a wholesaler, you do not want to take and put an offer in your own name. Always run it through a business entity. So for wholesalers, the first thing you do before you go out there and you start engaging in business, you set up an LLC or a corporation, some type of entity to protect yourself, and make sure you get the tax status right. Because failure to get that tax status right can have ramifications when you switch to being an investor. Okay, so wholesaling's one. Let me switch now to if you want to buy real estate, right? And you want to be an investor, you want to hold it long term. So if I want to be a long-term investor, okay, or I'm buying investment real estate, then the situation's going to come up, when do we set up this LLC? Well, that depends on how you're buying. So if you buy for cash, a lot of people don't. Why would you? All right, use other people's money. If you're buying for cash, then I would say set up LLC prior to close, okay, and then close in the limited liability company. So every deal that I've done where I've bought for cash, I close directly in an LLC. Now, here's the thing: if you're buying for cash and you're making your offers. Now, what I just described with the wholesaler, one of the things that I do in my own investing is that I don't keep all my deals. I'll wholesale some of them off. And so when I tie up a property in the name of an LLC, I tend to tie everything up under a wholesaling LLC, or what I call an offer-making LLC. So if you make a lot of offers like I do in my investing, I have an entity set up right here. I call this my offer LLC right here. And this entity is not set up in a particular state, in my local state. I set up my offer entity in Wyoming because I want anonymity. And we can talk about that in a different video about when you should set up a Wyoming limited liability company. But for my offers, I'd like to keep a Wyoming LLC. I make offers in multiple states through this, but I set up my offers where I write them under the name of my LLC, such as big time limited liability company and or designated entity. So my LLC is big time LLC. I put that in the offer, and I put and or designated entity. Now pay attention to this right now I'm about to share with you, because this is important. Do not use and or signs. All right, that's good. If there's a real estate agent on the other side, it's going to throw them off into a tizzy. So use and or designated entity. And if you are asked, why did you put this additional language in your offer? This is how you respond. You tell them that your CPA or attorney, pick one, has requested that you put that in because for estate and tax planning purposes, they have not yet determined what is the best way for you to take title, if it's in this entity or a different entity. That's what you got to say. Now, why do I tell them that? Because when you bring up the word attorney or CPA, typically the seller or their agent is going to back down. All right, so there's tax reasons behind it. The reason I set it up this way is because I never intend to close in my offer entity. I'm going to close in a different LLC, or I'm going to wholesale it and somebody else is going to close on it. So when you're buying for cash, have an offer LLC set up, make all your offers under this LLC, but you don't close in it. You'll actually close on a separate limited liability company right here. Now that LLC will definitely be set up in the state where you're buying the property in. So for example, I buy a lot in North Carolina. So in this case, this would be a North Carolina limited liability company, which would take title to the property. And again, I'm buying for cash. So this works when you're buying for cash. Now, if you're not buying for cash, and instead what you're doing is you're using financing. Okay, so when we're using financing, it's a little different. So if we're going to get a loan on the property, you have to know what type of loan are we obtaining. Is it going to be a conventional loan or is it going to be a DSCR loan, debt service coverage ratio loan? Now, if you're new to investing, you don't qualify for this. Typically, you're not going to be able to get a DSCR loan. Now, why is that important? Because you're going to see here in just a moment, but depending on the type of loan you obtain, you're going to may or may not be able to close in an LLC. So let's just look at the conventional loan right here. So if you're going to go down the conventional route, you're going to find a house and you're going to get a conventional loan to close on this property, investment property, then most of those loans are underwritten by Freddie or Fannie. And Freddie or Fannie guidelines do not allow residential real estate to be closed in a business entity. So you cannot take title in an LLC. You're going to have to close in your own name. Now, if you're using a portfolio lender, and a portfolio lender would be a community bank, someone like that's going to keep the note and they don't intend to sell it, so they're not using the Freddie or Fannie guidelines, well, then maybe you could close in the LLC. I've done that before with my community bank. First Citizens Bank here in Washington I work with. I've been able to close in an LLC with them, but they held the note. So we're not underwriting that with Freddie or Fannie guidelines, but most lenders underwrite with their guidelines. So their guidelines prohibit you from closing in an LLC if it's residential real estate, which is defined as 4 units or less. So what that means is that if I find a property, all right, so I spy this property right here that I want to close on, I want to buy, and this property happens to be located in Colorado. Well, there's no reason for me to run out there and set up a Colorado LLC if I'm using a conventional note or loan. So what I'll do is I'll close in my own name, and then after I've closed, so after I have taken title to this property, then I will come up here and I'll create my Colorado LLC, and I will then transfer my property into the limited liability company for asset protection. So that's when we'll do it. So it's a step-by-step transaction. Oh, by the way, when I was discussing the example when you're buying for cash and closing in an LLC, one asterisk I'd like to throw on that is that if you intend to do a cash out refi on that property within 6 months of closing and pull your cash out, then you can close in the LLC, but you're going to have to probably pull that property out of the LLC as well to do that cash out refi. So maybe it makes sense to close in your own name and hold it that way until you've refied the property. Just something I'm going to throw an asterisk on there. I should have mentioned that. All right, so this is a conventional note. You're taking title in your own name. It's not a DSCR loan. Now, if you're going to go the DSCR route, then in that scenario, you can actually close directly in a limited liability company. So if you wanted to go the DSCR route, then I would set up my Colorado LLC and I would close directly in the LLC. So I'd have that LLC set up right away. Now, some other things to consider is that if you're an active investor, one of the things that I do personally, I started this years ago, if I know that I'm going to be investing in a particular state and I'm going to be buying multiple properties there, then I will oftentimes, like I invest a lot in North Carolina, I will set up several North Carolina LLCs, and I refer to those as shelf LLCs. So, my office, let's say I have a shelf right here, and I'll have all these limited liability companies set up on the shelf. I at least have 2 to 3 LLCs at all time ready to go. Because when I find a deal, what I'll do is say this one right here is ARC LLC, I'll pull ARC off, and that's the one that I'll end up closing in. So it's already ready to run when that opportunity comes along. What I found for investors, active investors, sometimes this trips them up, that they try to get an LLC set up and maybe the website's down with the Secretary of State or there's some other issues involved that prevent us from having that LLC ready to go at closing. So this is a way to get around that. If you know you're investing in a particular state, set up a few ahead of time and just have them ready to go. So wholesaling, we nailed that. We talked about investing for long-term properties. The last thing I'll throw is if you want to flip real estate. So if you're flipping, then like wholesaling, you want to set up your entity right away before you do any deals. So with flipping, it's a little different. We're going to actually use a multi-entity structure. So if you want to flip property, for example, if I was flipping real estate here in Washington State, I would set up a Washington LLC, taxes either an S or C-Corp. In fact, this could be the same entity I use for my wholesales. Well, to some extent, we may want to, again, you want to look at this. That's why you want to call us and set up a strategy session so we can analyze your individual situation. But you set up this entity, and this entity itself will never take title to property. It's there for tax reasons. This is what I call a tax blocker entity. You see, if you flip real estate, you run the risk that if you do it in your own name or you do it through an entity that's not treated as an S or C corporation, you can be treated as a dealer in the eyes of the IRS. And if you're a dealer, that has some serious negative tax ramifications for you. And we're not going to go deep into that. I'm not going to discuss it any more than that. But suffice to say, it can screw up your investing if you personally get tagged as a dealer. So if you want to flip, set up an entity that's treated as an S or a C corporation. Okay, so it's a tax blocker. But we don't close or take title to real estate in this entity. Instead, what we're going to do when we find flip deals, we set up, some people call these special purpose LLCs, meaning they're established just for one particular purpose, which is to hold that flip property. So if I had 2 flips, I would put each individual flip in a separate limited liability company. You don't want to combine them, okay, in case something goes wrong with one of the flips. And I can tell you some stories on that. We could go for 30 minutes talking about people that have flipped real estate that I've been worked with over the past 25 years that have run into problems because they did not heed this advice. 1 property per LLC. And so each of those LLCs are owned by your flipping company that we just established. And then when you flip the property out of the LLC, you shut it down. So if you want to flip, then I would recommend you do this. You set up your LLC right away. So you set up this LLC immediately, and then you set up at least 2 other LLCs in the state where you're flipping in. Again, for the same reason I talked about with the shelf entities, right? You have them ready to go. Because flip deals many times are cash deals, or maybe you're using an HM, a hard money lender, in order to close on it, and that can happen really fast. So you got to be ready to take action when that opportunity comes along. And the last thing you want to be doing is closing in the wrong entity and then having a deed to a different entity, because that could hit you with possibly transfer taxes depending on your state, because it's not an exempt transfer going from entity to entity. So to keep it as clean as possible for people who flip, this is the structure that I would recommend. All right, so we covered 3 different strategies here. I hope you gained something out of this, understanding that when it comes to setting up an LLC, it's really dependent on the type of investing that you're getting involved with. Now, if you're already investing, you have properties in your own name, well, you need a lot of limited liability companies, and you should have those protected right away. So these are all reasons why you should be reaching out to us and setting up a strategy session to discuss what works best for your individual situation. Take care.